everybody. I'm Madison Mayfield. I'm really excited to be doing my residency here at the Montana Natural History Center. As you kind of heard in my bio, I'm really obsessed with working in museums and especially taxidermy, so getting to work in this space is kind of like a dream come true. And it's been a bit overwhelming how much inspiration and reference material there is. So since we're only about halfway into the residency, I don't have a ton of completed work to show you guys. So most of my talk, I'm going to kind of talk about the fields I've worked in and kind of give a bit of background into those in case you guys have never heard of scientific illustration or you don't really know what goes into taxidermy or even what happens at museums. So all of that work is kind of what feeds into my art. So that's why I call myself a natural history artist, because there are kind of a few fields that I draw from that inspire me. And you can see that in my personal artwork. I kind of tend to focus on museum specimens, and that includes taxidermy work as well. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is scientific illustration. So I, first and foremost, am a scientific illustrator. I graduated from the Natural Science Illustration program at the University of Washington in 2016, and I've pretty much been doing scientific illustration ever since then. And the work of a scientific illustrator is a bit different from, traditional artists. It's very precise and rigid, so you don't have a lot of room to put your own kind of oomph into it. It has to be very straightforward. So my own personal art, you can kind of see that I still use my scientific illustration background to mostly just illustrate or paint what I'm seeing. So what is scientific illustration? This is a really nice quote from the Guild of Natural Science Illustrators that I think kind of wraps it all up. But basically, scientific illustration is just art in the service of science. So normally, scientific illustrators have to produce work that communicates science very clearly, and it's very easy to read and straightforward, and it tends to be very rigid and precise and accurate, and involves a lot of measurements, a lot of research, a lot of back and forth with the scientist or researcher you're producing the work for. There's even a lighting convention that scientific illustrators have to use so that there's consistency across the board depending on who the artist is. So if I'm to illustrate an object, I have to light it from the upper left-hand corner so that, if there's multiple artists working, all of the work looks consistent. And there's kind of a few genres that scientific illustrators work in. Some of the most popular and well-known are paleo art. That's people who are illustrating extinct species, so people who draw dinosaurs. Medical illustration is a huge field, and medical illustrators tend to get a lot more training. They often have master's degrees or PhDs in scientific illustration because their work has to be very precise and the field is constantly changing. But I tend to work in zoological illustration, so doing mostly animals and sometimes plants. And the biggest question I get when I tell people I'm a scientific illustrator is, why does this field even exist? We have cameras, can't we take a photo? Isn't your work kind of relevant? The answer is no, and it never will be, because you can have the best camera equipment in the world and you can be the best photographer, but you simply cannot take photos of certain things. And illustrators, scientific illustrators, kind of can take an image or a photograph and synthesize it to make it more clear, more readable. We can focus on specific aspects of that image, and we can illustrate things that you just simply can't capture on camera. One of my favorite examples is medical illustrators. It's not really great to take a photo of a cadaver for internal organs. It looks a little bit messy, so medical illustrators are a great example of how an illustration works a lot better than a photograph. And illustrators also can make really fun and informative educational infographics. So sometimes when you look at a panel at a national park, an illustration is going to be more engaging than just a photograph. So these are just a few examples of some of my work that I've done with researchers. So these are very traditional scientific illustrations. A lot of the times I'm asked to illustrate species that there might not even be photos of, or there's one photo and it's really crappy and blurry, and I have to take references from similar species to kind of guess what this animal looks like and then illustrate it. So that's what these bird illustrations were. Oftentimes I'm asked to just illustrate something so that you really highlight one part that the scientist is trying to focus on. So this bat illustration, you can very easily use a photo of a bat with a bat fly on it, but they're kind of hard to see, they're really small, and it's just a lot clearer when you have just like a black and white line drawing. And then this illustration on the bottom right-hand corner was to describe a new species of rodent that was discovered in Papua New Guinea a few years ago. But the scientist who was studying them wasn't there when it was captured. They only caught one specimen. So all he got were really crappy photos to describe this species. And one of the defining features of this rodent is that it has this extra little foot pad on its foot. But the only photo was through like a mesh bag and it was really blurry. So I was given that photo and I had to create this illustration to make it really clear that this is a defining characteristic of the species. I do a lot of like life cycles or events to make them kind of easy to read all in one image. Lots of species-specific illustrations, so these are the types of things you would see in like a field guide. So they tend to be a bit more simplified, not super detailed, because you kind of just want it to be a general like amalgamation of all the individuals in the species. So if someone's out in the wild and has a field guide, they can look at your illustration and go, oh, that looks close enough, I guess that's what the species is. And then these are just some other random pieces that I've had to work on. But you can see that scientific illustrators, we have to work in a lot of different mediums. We're trained in watercolor, pen and ink, digital work's becoming a lot more popular, and the medium I work in really just depends on what the client wants and what I'm illustrating. So something like that pine cone that's super detailed, it had to be 1-to-1 to scale. I had to measure every scale. Wouldn't really make sense to do in watercolor because it's not as easy to work with. So pen and ink is great for really technical stuff, and then when you can be a bit more expressive, you can use watercolor or colored pencil. So yeah, that's my work for scientific illustration, and as you can see, I don't have a lot of freedom to kind of put in extra stuff into these illustrations. So again, that's kind of the same in my own personal artwork. I don't tend to put a lot of extra things in the background. I tend to focus on one object just because that's how I've always worked in art and it's kind of how I observe things. And so the other field I kind of work in is taxidermy, and this also gets a reaction out of people generally when I tell them. I feel like in Montana it's a bit more commonplace, but I figured I would just go through kind of what taxidermy is, especially since we're in a room filled with great taxidermy. So the word taxidermy means arrangement of skin, and this is a pretty good description of what you do as a taxidermist. Just really simplified, you're taking an animal, you're skinning it, you're removing all the insides, replacing those with like a fake body, putting the skin back on, and arranging it to look lifelike. And there are a few kind of types of taxidermy. Really the only two are commercial taxidermy and museum. And the only difference between these two types of taxidermy are that museum taxidermy is a bit more bespoke. You're generally going to be working on a species that you might not get to work on otherwise. It might be rare, it might be foreign, and you're generally putting a bit more research into it because there might not be a taxidermy form or anyone you know who's taxidermied this type of animal before. Keep bumping into this. Commercial taxidermists tend to do more trophy mounts, so game animals, so they're kind of producing a lot more of the same thing, but the general practice is the same in museums and commercial. The taxidermy practice is pretty consistent across the board. And then there's museum study skins. So these aren't really taxidermy because they're not made to look lifelike, but the process of making a study skin is the same initial steps as taxidermy, so a lot of people call them taxidermy. And the process, I'll just go through a quick overview. This is a really great photo of a giraffe, I think at the American Museum of Natural History in New York, being done. So there's a bit of a difference between working on bird taxidermy and working on mammal taxidermy. With birds, the feathers are embedded in the skin. So when you skin a bird, all the feathers stay intact. So it's actually pretty straightforward. You just skin it and remove the body, and you kind of peel the skin off like you're taking off a sweater, and you're left with the skull exposed, and you clean that and leave it because the bill is attached. And then you would make a replica body, which is what's in the upper right-hand corner. You would either carve it out of foam, wood. Some people wrap the bodies, which is the old school way to do it. And this is like wood wool bound really tightly in string. And then you put that body back in, put the skin over it, run wire up the legs and the wings, and attach that wire back into the body form. So you're like reattaching the joints. And then you sew up the bird, and you basically pose it and feather it. Mammals are fairly similar, the only difference being you tend to not leave any bones inside of the mammal, so you're taking the entire skin off, and then you can either carve the body from scratch, or there's also taxidermy companies that sell these forms that are in pre-made poses, and people can either use them as is or edit them a little bit. And then the skin of a mammal is tanned and treated so that it's stabilized, and then put back on this form and sewn up and groomed. But the process is fairly similar. And I just like to include this extra photo of some X-ray taxidermy. You can see the wire armature in them. It's kind of like the replacement skeleton. And these are probably older because you can see in the mammal, it looks like you can see the skull and leg bones, and you generally wouldn't leave those in anymore. So I can't talk about taxidermy without talking about Carl Akeley. He's known as the father of taxidermy. He's kind of credited with creating the techniques that all modern taxidermists use. So taxidermy hasn't changed much in like 100 and so years, basically since he created the techniques that are used today. And he was kind of an all-around naturalist, artist, scientist, kind of badass. He was insistent on going out and collecting his own specimens, so he went on several collection trips to Africa, where he almost died twice. Those photos in the middle, he was trampled by a bull elephant when he was trying to hunt it, so he had to lay in bed and rest for like a month, and he's looking really sad in the mirror at himself. Then the photo of him next to this leopard, when he was hunting this leopard, it attacked him and pinned him to the ground, and he killed it with his hands by sticking his hand down its throat and choking it from the inside out. So that's why he has a brace on his arm. And supposedly he took this back to the States and mounted it, and there's not a lot of documentation about what happened to it. A lot of people think that it's still on display at the Field Museum, but it's not 100% certain. But basically the reason his technique is so popular and so different is because he kind of turned it into sculpture. So before Carl Akeley, a lot of taxidermy was literally just stuffed animals that maybe had some sticks in them, and they kind of just looked like tubes. They didn't look like the real animal at all. But Carl Akeley, he would take the skeleton of the animal and he would re-articulate it and then build the musculature using the real body as reference around that skeleton and basically make like a cast form that was extremely accurate. And he had also observed the animals in the wild. So his final pieces were kind of like nothing anyone had seen before. And he did such a good job that most of his work is still on display today. If you've ever been to the American Museum of Natural History in New York and you've been in the African Hall of Mammals, he mounted almost everything in there. So all those things are like 100 years old and they still look amazing. And this is him working on the elephants at the Field Museum, which are still on display today. So Carl Akeley gets a lot of credit for taxidermy, but the fact is that he actually stole his technique from this woman named Martha Maxwell. So it turns out a woman is actually the one we can credit with taxidermy today. And Martha was a bit of an anomaly. She's the first woman credited for going out and collecting her own specimens and mounting them herself. So she used to go out into the Rockies by herself with her gun and would hunt all of these animals and collect references and plants as well. And she used the technique I just described Carl Akeley using to make really lifelike mounts. And she would actually make dioramas with plants that she found in the environment as well. And in 1876, she made a really big diorama that had a bunch of different species. It actually had flowing water in it. It was kind of like the first diorama of its kind. And she submitted it to the Philadelphia Centennial Exhibition. But because she was a woman and people thought taxidermy was kind of kitschy and weird and gross, she didn't really get any praise for her work. And when she passed away, all of her taxidermy was handed down to a relative who stored it in a barn, and it got rained on, it got eaten by rats, and then it burned in a fire. So there's no record of any of her work other than photos. But we know that Carl Akeley went and saw her diorama in person, and a lot of people think that that's what inspired him to start working on taxidermy. So all of this is to say that taxidermy is actually a really beautiful art form. It's essentially sculpture using the real animal, and award-winning taxidermists today are incredible artists and put a lot of effort and study into their work. And the reason I kind of got into taxidermy was when I started working at the Queensland Museum in Australia. I was brought on to work on the Discovery Centre, which was like a big reference center of all of the unique wildlife you can find in Queensland, Australia. So the project involved taking 1,200 existing taxidermy mounts and basically refurbishing them, recoloring them, conserving them, and moving them upstairs into a new exhibit, and also replacing mounts that were just hideous and didn't really represent the species very well. So this is a photo of the old Discovery Centre. And I know you guys might not be super familiar with Australian animals, but all of these taxidermy mounts are super old, super faded. For reference, the guy up here, that's a Tasmanian devil. They're normally black and also don't really look like that. So we tried to fix what we could. If we didn't have a replacement specimen, we tried to recolor the fur, we tried to stabilize the mount. If we did have a replacement specimen, we mounted it so that we had a nice, lifelike looking specimen that people could learn from, because a lot of these animals are nocturnal, so even people who grew up in Australia might not ever get to see them in their entire life. So this is a photo of a case that was redone. There's more color and everything. Some of the mounts are still old, but a lot of them are new. And so I got to work with the taxidermist at the museum, Alison Douglas. She's kind of like one of the leading Australian mammal taxidermists in Australia. And so I got to learn from her and do some taxidermy for display, which was amazing. So this is some of the stuff I worked on. On the left is probably my favorite thing that I've gotten to do. It's a tawny frogmouth family. These guys are really common backyard birds in Brisbane, and they're super fun, super cool. I got to do an echidna, which was crazy. There's only a handful of museums in Australia, and there's kind of a running joke amongst them that the echidnas are just horribly done. A lot of them are from like the 19th century and either look like pancakes or massive balloons. So it was really nice to be able to do like a lifelike representation of an echidna. And then I got to work on a cassowary, which was the coolest thing in the world. I never thought I'd get so close to such a dangerous and endangered animal. But this is kind of an example of why museum taxidermy is a bit different. A commercial taxidermist would almost never get to work on a cassowary, and there's not many people in the world who've ever taxidermied a cassowary, so it's hard to know how to do it. And you can't really buy a form that's pre-made. So part of this project as well is we had to keep the skeleton to be fully articulated, which means we couldn't use the skull of the bird in the taxidermy mount. So Alison Douglas, who's pictured putting the skin on, she actually molded and cast the head and the feet. So there's absolutely nothing on this bird that's original except for the skin and the feathers, and she painted the head and feet. So it's definitely art. My favorite thing to work on was small birds. A lot of taxidermists kind of shy away from them because they can be really finicky and fiddly and just kind of a pain in the ass. But I love doing them. I think it's really fun to kind of stare at them for hours and feather them, and they're just really intricate. And so I was the go-to for small birds. And so kind of like with scientific illustration, people often ask me, why is taxidermy still a thing? Why do we kill things? Why do we mount dead things? Isn't that kind of weird? And the truth is that most museum taxidermy especially, the animals aren't being killed for the purpose of taxidermy. Most museums nowadays get all of their specimens as donations, either from like national parks or zoos or wildlife rehabilitators. It's very rare that a museum will go out and collect specimens nowadays. And taxidermy serves as an educational purpose, just like scientific illustration does. A lot of people won't ever get to see certain species in real life, and it's a way for people to kind of travel without leaving a museum and see different animals that they might never see and maybe learn about them and want to conserve them. But they're also a representation of species, and there's a few dozen species that are now extinct that we still have taxidermy mounts of, which I think is really cool. The thylacine is a great example. I think there's only like 9 taxidermy mounts that are in existence of the Tasmanian tiger, and scientists can use fur from those mounts to learn things. There's probably bones in a lot of them. Passenger pigeons are another one. There's tons of taxidermy mounts of passenger pigeons that are still in circulation. And then this tortoise is kind of a sad example, but it's a species of Galapagos tortoise that recently went extinct. So this guy, I think he was called Big George, he was the last to die, and he was given to the taxidermist at the museum in New York City, and he did a really beautiful job mounting him. And so I think it's a really cool way to honor these animals after they pass on, to use them for educational purposes. And I think when taxidermy is done well, it can be really respectful. And so the last thing I kind of work in is natural history collections. So for those who don't know, a natural history collection is normally tied to a natural history museum or part of a university. And it's essentially this massive collection filled with a bunch of specimens of as many species as possible, and they're used for research purposes. My favorite part about them is study skins, which is what you call the bird and mammals that are in these collections, and this is a photo of some bird study skins. So what is a study skin? It's how birds and mammals are preserved in these collections, and it's very similar to taxidermy in that you skin and remove the insides, but instead of making them look lifelike, you're stuffing them with cotton and laying them as flat and like as thin as possible so you can fit as many into a drawer as possible, because the whole purpose is to keep on collecting and you kind of run out of space. So they're all lined up together in these drawers and used for research purposes by scientists who are looking into a wide variety of topics. And this is just a little image of how you make a study skin. And so why are there so many of each species in these collections? And a lot of people say, couldn't we do like a Noah's Ark situation and save one of each species and call it a day? And the answer for that is you want more, because the more you have, the more data you have, the larger your sample size, the better your science is going to be if you're looking at something involving a species in a collection. So every single animal that's in a collection comes with information. It has these little tags on it as well as reference materials in a database. So this will have the location where the animal was found, the date it was found, was it a juvenile, was it an adult, was it male, female, all of this information that's relevant to science. So without this information, if a tag is lost or if you don't know where a specimen came from, it's absolutely worthless. So data is really important with these collections. And people can actually learn a lot from these drawers of dead things. And a lot of times people wonder, well, why do we keep collecting? And the reason is you want samples from across a long period of time because you can learn more. If you have specimens that are 100 years old, you can potentially learn about the environment back then. You can learn about the impact people have had on that species. And on top of that, there are often species that just exist in these collections that nobody has discovered. And that might be because they're, only separable by DNA or what have you. But it's pretty common that a new species will be discovered just because someone decided to sit and look at a bunch of bones in a collection that were collected like 100 years ago. So these are some of my favorite examples of science in collections. This one's really cool. All the birds on the left that look super dirty, they were collected during the Industrial Revolution, so that's soot all over their feathers. And then the ones that look clean on the right were collected once we started to have regulations put in place controlling like CO2 emissions. So you can very visibly see the effect that we have had on species just from looking at them alone. This was another species that was just discovered. This crocodile skeleton had just been sitting in a collection and someone was like, hey, this looks a little bit different, and it was a new species. Scientists can also pull feathers from old bird specimens and look at the isotopes in the feathers and actually find out where birds have traveled. And they can do this on really old specimens as well, which is super interesting. And Also another reason to keep old specimens, you never know what new technology might come around. And this is a super recent paper that came out where scientists at the Field Museum looked at fish in their collection as far back as the 1910s and looked at their gut contents and found that there's plastic in fish as far back as the 1950s. So we wouldn't know this if we didn't keep all of these old specimens that some people think might not be worth keeping around. And so I got into collections because my mom actually worked at the Field Museum when I was younger. That's her on the left. So I've kind of always grown up in these spaces. And then in 2011, I learned to do my first bird study scan at the Field Museum and thought it was super cool, but then didn't really have a chance to get back into collections until I worked at the museum in Australia. And so after the exhibition there, I just worked in the collection and prepped birds and mammals day in and day out. And getting to work on these animals up close and see things that I certainly wouldn't get to see just walking around in the wild was a really special experience. And you kind of feel like you're creating art when you create a study skin, because ideally what you're making will last, it will outlive you, it'll last 100+ years and hopefully contribute to science. And you start to put a lot of effort into it and a lot of attention to detail. I included this because this is an endangered glossy black cockatoo that I got to prep. This was a nestling that fell out of its nest and died. These guys were heavily affected by the bushfires in Australia in 2020. So again, getting to work on super rare animals that will most likely go extinct in my lifetime is kind of indescribable. This is a feather-tailed rider. They're just really cool. Some more birds. So after working in collections, it's kind of hard not to be inspired by them to make art. You look at them and they're so beautiful and visually engaging, and especially birds for me. It's not often you get to see a bird so close and so still, and you really get to admire them when they're kind of in this form. But I also really like to work on study skins because a lot of these collections aren't open to the public. They are if you ask, but a lot of people don't know they exist, and they're a very important part of science, and I think it's actually a detriment to them that more people don't know about them and have never seen them, because if you don't know about it, you're not going to care, and they tend to be underfunded for that reason. So much in the way I use scientific illustration to, teach science, I do like to focus my art on these types of specimens to educate people about them and kind of bring their attention to them, and hopefully other people will be intrigued and interested in them. And there is actually a collection like this on the University of Montana campus, and it's associated with the Montana Natural History Center. And that's the Philip L. Wright Zoological Museum. It's really cool. Definitely go check it out if you ever have a chance. And if you take nothing else away from my talk today, I highly recommend that you read this book. It's all about collections and study skins. It's a true story, and it's insane, and it's very good. So why do all these things relate? Why do I kind of merge them together in my art? I think they have a long history of being related, so I'm just going to kind of give a brief history lesson. Scientific illustration and taxidermy have been a part of human existence for a very long time. There are cave paintings that we can actually identify species from 30,000 BC. So that right there is scientific illustration. Egyptians are kind of credited with starting taxidermy with animal embalming, but both of these art forms kind of took off during the age of exploration, when you have people going out on boats and exploring foreign lands. And when you don't have a camera, the only way you can document things is either by drawing them or killing them and bringing them back and mounting them. So one of my favorite intersections of taxidermy and scientific illustration has to do with this rhino image right here. So the story goes that in 1514, a king in India captured a rhino and sent it to the king of Portugal. And this rhino was the first live rhino that anyone in Europe had ever seen. So it was kind of a huge deal. People came from all over to observe it. But the king quickly put it on a boat and sent it to Rome so people there could see it. But the boat sank on the way there, and the rhino, being chained in shackles, drowned. But it actually washed up on shore and was recovered and taxidermied. And it's the first historical record of taxidermy that we know of. It was put on display in Florence. And then the next year, Albert Durr made this image of a rhino, but he never actually got to see the rhino. He created this illustration based off of first-hand accounts that people gave him who had seen it in person. So he simply took descriptions and created this illustration, which is kind of insane. It's very accurate if you think about that. If someone told me what a rhino looked like and I had to draw it, it would be horrible. But not everyone is as talented as Durr, so this is another example of a walrus that was illustrated only through first-hand accounts, so the artist had never actually seen one. So it's not very accurate. Same with this taxidermy walrus. This is very famous, and the reason it looks so bad and why so much old taxidermy looks so bad is because the person working on it had never seen the animal in real life. They were normally sent a skin and kind of just had to guess what the animal looked like. So this guy got the skin, saw all these wrinkles in it, and thought, oh, it's traveled by boat, it's just really wrinkly, I'll smooth those out and make it better. And instead you get a walrus balloon. So references are super important in both of these fields to make accurate representations. And it makes me wonder if the person who did this beaver behind everybody had ever seen one. So both taxidermy and scientific illustration kind of take off during the Victorian era when you have women wearing taxidermy birds as fashion, but you also have more naturalists going out and exploring and collecting specimens. So Charles Darwin is obviously the best known of these naturalists. He collected like 500 birds on his voyage on the HMS Beagle, and not only did he illustrate them, but he also made study skins. And the technique he used is the exact same technique that's still used today to make study skins. It worked so well that a lot of these birds are still exist in collections. And he likely taxidermied some as well. If you look at the bird all the way on the left, it has a glass eye in it, which means it was probably a taxidermy mount and then was taken off display and kind of stored with the study skins. Alfred Russel Wallace was another naturalist who used scientific illustration and kind of taxidermy study skins to preserve what he collected. He collected over 126,000 specimens in the Malay Archipelago, and a lot of his study skins still exist in collections today. And then Audubon is probably the most well-known scientific illustrator when people kind of think of the genre, but it's really hard to draw a bird when you can't take a photo of it and it's living and moving and flying. And so the reason his illustrations are so good is because he went out with two taxidermists who shot birds for him, mounted them in the pose he wanted, and then he drew from that taxidermy. So taxidermists and scientific illustrators have kind of always worked together. And both of the fields require a lot of measurement and accuracy in order to replicate exactly what you see in the wild. And a lot of taxidermists end up being really amazing artists and anatomists. Anyways, this is the work of Leon Prey, who's an award-winning taxidermist, and I mean, this is amazing scientific illustration. And today, most taxidermists who are award-winning are incredible sculptors. There's something called the World Taxidermy Championships, and there's actually a part of this competition that is only sculpting. People will live sculpt these forms, and they're just judged on that alone. So it's really a beautiful art form. And scientific illustrators are often taught to sculpt miniature maquettes in order to help them illustrate animals from different angles and get musculature correct as well. Cast painting is another area where scientific illustration really blends well with taxidermy. A lot of fish and reptile taxidermy nowadays is done as replicas, so you're basically molding and casting the animal, and the final product has no original parts. It's completely like plastic, or it's just a replica and then it's painted. So these are some casts that I've had to paint as part of the museum, and it was basically like taking my scientific illustration and putting it onto a 3D form, which was really cool. And then dioramas are kind of the pinnacle of all of these things, of taxidermy, of scientific illustration, of museum collections. There's a lot of science that goes into them to make them as accurate as possible, and they communicate science to people in a really amazing way. And kind of my ultimate dream as an artist would be to work on one of these or create one myself, even if it's in a miniature form. So how does this relate to what I'm doing here? There's a lot on my mind when I think of all of these different areas and what I could potentially do during my time here. But like I said, kind of the first thing I get drawn to is study skins, because I just think they're so cool, and not everybody knows what they are. And when I first walked in here, I noticed that there's a few study skins in tubes over in this corner that people can interact with. So I immediately decided to draw them. This is the piece I created. But part of me has also always wanted, not always, but more recently been interested in doing more 3D work, because taxidermy is 3D and you're just using the real animal as your medium. I think it is an intro to sculpture, but working as a taxidermist, it can be kind of hard to get your hands on specimens if you don't have the proper permits. A lot of native species are protected, so you can't just pick up whatever you find on the street and decide to taxidermy it. So it can be kind of hard to work on things that you really want to, and I've been thinking a lot about a solution for that is essentially carving my own taxidermy. So making a sculpture that looks like a taxidermy mount but has nothing to do with the animal itself. And I'm new to sculpture, so I figured the easiest thing to jump into would be study skins, since they're kind of tube-like, and really the most defining feature is the beak and the bill. So I took these same tube birds over there and made a wire armature and wrapped that in aluminum foil, and then have been using like a thin layer of Sculpey on top, which is a really nice beginner sculpting material. And then I'm gonna paint them. So I'm kind of hoping to do a few of these. It's kind of like a weird way for me to do study skins without having the real animal in front of me. And I also just love the visual of like a bird popsicle. I think they're super fun. I was really lucky last week to get to go into the Philip L. Wright collection and actually prep a bird. I haven't done that in a long time. So that in and of itself feels like making art. I also did some watercolor sketching while I was there, and I think I would love to, in the future, kind of focus on some works that also portray the steps that go into study skins, kind of like a behind the scenes of what the people in these spaces are working on, because that's not super well documented either. And then when you're in a museum space like this, there often tends to be a lot of random objects that you find that nobody knows where they came from. Nobody really knows what to do with them, but you don't really want to throw them away. How could you throw away a random bird head that you find? It feels like sacrilege to do that to that poor animal. So I was messing around in the back and found this box of bird heads that just exist. So I decided to paint them again to kind of represent what's behind the scenes in a lot of these museum spaces that people don't often get to see. And then another little project I've been working on is just sketching some of the taxidermy mounts, specifically the birds, and making a time lapse and pairing that with the bird song. It's kind of just been a way for me to keep working and also learn bird songs, because I'm not very well versed in them. So this is a meadowlark. So that was cool. So yeah, that one's just sitting over there. And I have a few more as well, but I figured I would just share that one since it's the state bird. I'm also really interested in these old Victorian style bird domes. These are both from the Philip L. Wright collection, and I think ultimately when I feel more comfortable with sculpture, I would love to recreate these, sculpting them, so not using any real birds or anything, because they're basically miniature dioramas, and I just find them really beautiful. And yeah, most of my other work will probably focus on collections and specimens. Again, like I said, it's hard not to look at these and want to just paint them. They're so beautiful and just like visually striking. And I also just think they're not just birds. Because they were prepped by somebody, they were collected by somebody, they're also historical artifacts. You can learn a lot, not just about animals, from these specimens. And since the process of making them and the process of scientific illustration and taxidermy, they've all kind of been the same for almost 100 years or more. When you practice any of these art forms, you kind of feel like you're part of history and you're doing the same steps that kind of everyone before you did, which is really interesting and kind of makes you feel a bit connected to those people. So I just wanted to thank Open Air and Stony in particular. This is such a great opportunity. This is my first artist residency, and it just feels like the perfect space. And then, of course, thank you to the Montana Natural History Center for having me. It's been so fun and nice to just kind of have free reign to do whatever.